Episode 5, Thunder and Ice. Previously, Thor reached King's Landing, hours before the Night King's army, finding the council fracturing under pressure as Cersei proposed surrendering him to save the city. After rallying the council to coordinate defense, the siege began. 300,000 whites assaulting the capital's walls in the greatest battle Westeros has ever faced. The initial 3-hour assault killed 20,000 whites, but cost 2,000 defenders, exchange ratios that make victory impossible through attrition. Thor realized the only way to prevent slow defeat is forcing decisive engagement, challenging the Night King to single combat, betting everything on the hope that killing the ancient being will destroy the magical coordination holding his army together. Now, as the second wave of assaults begins, Thor prepares to face 8,000 years of accumulated dark magic in a battle that will determine whether gods can defeat winter or whether winter always wins. The challenge was delivered at dawn of the first day, when exhausted defenders had barely caught their breath from the initial assault, and the Night King's forces were consolidating for another wave. Thor stood on King's Landing's highest wall, Mjolnir raised above his head, lightning crackling around the hammer with intensity that illuminated the entire city. When he spoke, he used divine projection to ensure his voice carried across the battlefield to every White Walker, and most importantly to the Night King himself. Night King, Thor's voice rang out like thunder made verbal. You have besieged this city for one purpose, to prove that winter defeats gods. By that, death is inevitable, even for those who claim divinity. You want to demonstrate that the age of heroes ended because heroes always fail when facing you. I offer you the chance to prove it. Single combat, you and I, on neutral ground where neither of us has tactical advantage. If you win, you've proven your thesis, that winter is stronger than thunder, that death defeats life, that 8,000 years of accumulated power exceeds divine strength. If I win, your army loses coordination and King's Landing survives. One battle. Winner determines the siege outcome, or are you too cowardly to face me without 300,000 corpses supporting you? The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. For a long moment there was no response. The White Army stood motionless, awaiting orders from the being that controlled them. The defenders on the walls held their breath, recognizing that Thor had just gambled everything on the hope that the Night King's pride would override his tactical patience. Then the Night King moved. He dismounted from his undead dragon and walked forward through the mass of his own army, whites parting to create a path as their master approached the walls. He stopped perhaps 100 yards from King's Landing's gates, visible to every defender, clearly illuminated by the dawn light breaking through storm clouds. When the Night King spoke, his voice bypassed sound to strike directly into Thor's mind and into the minds of every person on the walls, making them witnesses to the exchange. Thor of Asgard, god of thunder, you offer single combat as if it were a gift, as if granting me the opportunity to face you personally were an act of generosity rather than desperation. I accept, not because your challenge threatens me, but because killing you publicly will demonstrate to everyone watching that divine power means nothing when facing the inevitability of winter. Your death will break the defender's will more thoroughly than any siege. Your corpse, raised to serve me, will prove that gods are simply powerful mortals who haven't yet met a power greater than themselves. The Night King gestured, and the frozen Blackwater Bay transformed. Ice that had been merely solid became a perfectly flat arena, a circle perhaps 200 yards in diameter, surrounded by walls of ice that rose 50 feet high. A natural amphitheater created in seconds through magic that reshaped matter with the casual ease Thor used to summon lightning. Neutral ground, the Night King continued. No tactical advantage except what skill and power provide. No armies to interfere. No dragons to intervene. Just you and I determining through combat what words can never resolve, whether life or death is the stronger force. Enter the arena, God of Thunder. Show me whether Asgard's warriors are worthy of the legends they've inspired, or whether you're simply another hero who'll learn that courage without wisdom is just another form of weakness. Thor descended from the walls, leaving Mjolnir momentarily to address the defenders who'd be fighting without him. Daenerys has command while I'm engaged, Thor announced to the soldiers gathered at the gates. Hold the walls. Trust the council to coordinate defense. And if I fall, if the Night King proves stronger, don't break formation trying to avenge me. Hold. Survive. Win despite my failure rather than dying because of it. The realm matters more than any individual, even gods. Remember that. He looked at Daenerys specifically, finding her violet eyes and seeing the determination there, mixed with concern she couldn't quite hide. If he kills me and tries to raise me as a white, Thor said quietly enough that only she could hear, you burn me immediately. Don't hesitate, don't second guess, don't let sentiment override tactics, promise me. I promise, Daenerys replied, her voice steady, despite the weight of what she was agreeing to. But Thor, you don't have to fight him alone. My dragons could give him the excuse he needs to abandon single combat and resume the siege, Thor interrupted gently. This only works if it's actually single combat. The moment anyone interferes, the Night King will claim I broke the terms and use that to justify overwhelming force. I have to do this alone. Trust that I can. I do, Daenerys said, but that doesn't mean I'm happy about it. Neither am I, Thor admitted, but it's the only play that changes the mathematics. Hold the city, keep the council functioning, prove that the system works even when the protector can't protect. That's what matters. He gripped Mjolnir and walked toward the ice arena, every step feeling like walking toward his own execution, but also toward the only battle that actually mattered. Behind him, the defenders watched in silence, hundreds of thousands of eyes following the protector who destroyed their throne and who was now gambling his life on the belief that killing the Night King would save them. Thor entered the arena, and walls of ice sealed behind him with the finality of a tomb closing. The only witnesses now were the Night King, the frozen bay, and the gods. If any gods were watching beings like Thor who existed outside their normal purview, the Night King stood at the arena's center, ice sword in hand, waiting with the patient stillness of something that had existed for 8,000 years and would exist 8,000 more if this battle went as he expected. Before we begin, the Night King said, you should understand what you're actually facing. I was human once. A first man captured by the children of the forest during their war against humanity. They needed a weapon against human expansion, something that could turn humanity's numbers against itself, that could make death infectious rather than final. So they took me, drove dragonglass into my heart, and transformed me into the first White Walker through magic they barely understood and couldn't control. The Night King's ice sword gleamed as he spoke, reflecting light that shouldn't have existed in the enclosed arena. For 8,000 years, I have existed partially outside life and death, he continued, learning, growing, waiting for the barriers that limit my power to weaken. And then you arrived, tearing through dimensions, bringing energies that don't belong in this realm, weakening the boundaries between what is and what shouldn't be. You think your presence here is accident. The Bifrost doesn't malfunction. Dimensional bridges don't collapse randomly. Something called you to this realm, Thor of Asgard. Something wanted divine power here, creating the instability I needed to break free from limitations that had held me beyond the wall. You are not the solution to my threat. You are the cause, and killing you will complete the transformation that began the moment you arrived. Thor processed this revelation while maintaining combat readiness. If the Night King was right, if Thor's arrival had somehow enabled the Long Night's return, then the guilt was staggering. But guilt was useless in combat. Understanding was what mattered. Then why single combat? Thor asked. If you're winning through my presence enabling your power, why risk losing that advantage by facing me directly? Because power without proof is just potential, the Night King replied. I could win through siege, could starve King's Landing while my army grows, could achieve complete victory through patience and inevitability. But that would leave questions, would leave doubt about whether gods could have stopped me if they'd tried differently, would create legends about the protector who almost saved Westeros, but who was overwhelmed by numbers rather than defeated by superior strength. I don't want legends. I want absolute proof that winter is stronger than any power in existence, that death is inevitable regardless of divine intervention, that the long night ends everything, including gods who think they can defy it. The Night King raised his ice sword, and the temperature in the arena dropped 50 degrees instantly. So I face you here, the Night King concluded. Prove that even with all your power, even with divine strength and lightning, and 800 years of Asgardian combat training, you cannot defeat 8,000 years of accumulated dark magic. Your death will break the defender's will. Your resurrection as my servant will prove that gods are no different from mortals, just louder in their defiance before inevitability claims them. Now fight, Thor of Asgard. Show me whether Odin's son can succeed where every hero before him has failed. They met in the arena's center with the sound of breaking worlds. Thor struck first, Mjolnir sweeping in an arc that would have shattered mountains, backed by divine strength and desperation. The Night King parried with his ice sword, and the impact sent shockwaves radiating outward with enough force to crack the arena's frozen floor. Thor was physically stronger. That was immediately clear. Every blow he landed drove the Night King backward. Every strike of Mjolnir against Iceblade created damage that should have shattered the weapon. But the Night King's sword was made from the first winter's heart, forged through magic that predated human civilization, and it repaired itself between strikes as if damage was temporary condition rather than permanent state. The Night King was faster, not in raw speed but in economy of movement. No wasted motion, no telegraphing strikes. 8,000 years of combat experience compressed into perfect technique. He moved with the precision of water finding paths of least resistance. To his ice sword striking from angles Thor's Asgardian training hadn't accounted for because Asgardian enemies didn't move like concentrated winter given form. They fought across the arena, trading blows that would have killed armies, neither gaining decisive advantage despite both possessing overwhelming power. Thor's hammer destroyed ice beneath their feet with every impact. The Night King's sword left trails of frost that made footing treacherous. The air itself became a weapon, Thor's lightning making it burn with heat, while the Night King's cold made it hostile to breath. And with every exchange, Thor felt something disturbing. His power was depleting faster than it should. Every lightning strike, every hammer blow, every use of divine strength, all of it draining his reserves more quickly than normal combat would justify. The Night King was feeding on his power, not directly but through the dimensional instability the ancient being had mentioned. Thor's divine energy was leaking into the spaces between realities, and the Night King's magic was drinking it like water flowing downhill, which meant the more Thor used his power, the stronger his enemy became. "Clever trap," Thor gasped during a brief pause as they circled each other. "Make me think single combat is advantageous when actually it concentrates my power in a confined space where you can drain it. Fight defensively while I exhaust myself, trying to land a killing blow, then strike when I'm too depleted to resist effectively. You never intended to prove strength defeats me. You intended to prove patience does. And yet you continue fighting," the Night King observed, "because withdrawing means admitting you cannot win through honorable combat, and gods like you need honor more than victory. That psychological weakness is why heroes always fail. They fight on their terms even when those terms guarantee defeat. They choose glory over pragmatism. They die bravely rather than live through accepting that some battles cannot be won through courage." The Night King attacked with renewed intensity, ice swords striking in combinations that forced Thor into purely defensive posture. Every parry with Mjolnir cost energy, every block drained reserves. Thor was still stronger, still skilled enough to prevent killing blows, but he was losing ground gradually, inevitably, exactly as the Night King had planned. Thor made a decision that went against every instinct his Asgardian pride possessed. He stopped using his divine power. No lightning, no superhuman strength beyond what his base physiology provided. No channeling divine energy through Mjolnir to amplify strikes. Just technique, just combat skill, just 800 years of training applied to a fight he'd deliberately handicapped himself in. The change was immediately apparent. Thor's strikes became weaker, still formidable but no longer capable of driving the Night King backward through sheer force. But his reserves stopped depleting catastrophically. The power drain the Night King had been engineering lost its primary source. "Interesting choice," the Night King said, adjusting his own tactics to match Thor's reduced output. "You sacrifice your greatest advantage to prevent me from exploiting it. That's wisdom. Rare in warriors who've built their identity around overwhelming strength. But wisdom without sufficient power is just another path to defeat. You cannot kill me without using your full strength, and you cannot use your full strength without empowering me. The trap remains regardless of which option you choose." "Then I'll find the third option," Thor replied, his mind racing through tactical possibilities while maintaining defensive form. "The choice that doesn't rely on overpowering you through divine strength or outlasting you through mortal endurance. There's always a third option. I just need to survive long enough to find it." They fought for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. time distorting under the strain of combat where every second could mean death. Thor adapted to fighting without his power, relying on technique he'd learned but rarely needed, because divine strength usually made technique irrelevant. The Night King adapted to facing an opponent who wasn't feeding him energy, shifting from defensive patience to offensive pressure designed to force errors. And slowly, carefully, Thor began to see the pattern. The Night King's sword strikes always originated from the same side, his right, because the dragonglass shard embedded in his heart had transformed that side of his body more thoroughly than the left. It was minute difference, barely perceptible, but 8,000 years of fighting with that asymmetry had created infinitesimal preference for strikes that didn't stress the transformed tissue. The Night King's footwork always placed his left foot forward when defending, again because the dragonglass transformation made his right side slightly less flexible. Another infinitesimal detail that meant nothing in isolation but which suggested a pattern, and most critically, the Night King never allowed strikes to land near his heart, never accepted trades where Thor's hammer might hit his chest, even if it meant accepting strikes elsewhere. He was protecting the dragonglass shard, the original transformation point, the place where children of the forest magic had turned human into White Walker. Thor saw it clearly now. The Night King was effectively immortal, unkillable through conventional damage because he was already dead in every way that mattered. But the dragonglass shard was the anchor, the point where magic bound his consciousness to the undead form. Destroy that anchor and the transformation might unravel, might release whatever human consciousness remained after 8,000 years of being trapped in ice. It wasn't a weakness in the traditional sense. It was more like a pressure point, a place where precisely applied force could disrupt the system holding the Night King together. Thor needed one perfect strike. One moment where the Night King's defensive positioning left the chest exposed long enough for Mjolnir to strike the dragonglass shard with enough force to shatter it. The problem was creating that moment when the Night King had spent 8,000 years ensuring it never occurred. Outside the arena, the siege of King's Landing continued. Daenerys commanded from the walls, her tactical mind coordinating defense that should have been impossible for someone who'd never defended a city before. Her dragons burned white concentrations, while soldiers on the walls used dragonglass weapons to hold positions that conventional armies would have lost hours ago. The council functioned, barely, with Tyrion holding factions together through political brilliance that transformed panic into productive coordination. Oberyn commanded the walls with Dornish courage. Mace Tyrell managed reserves despite wanting to flee. Even Cersei contributed, using Lannister resources to prevent Flea Bottom from descending into rioting chaos. The system Thor had created was working, not perfectly, not without friction and near failures, but working. The council was proving that Westeros could govern itself during crisis without requiring a king to provide absolute authority or a god to protect them from consequences. But they were losing ground. Slowly, inexorably, the Whites' numerical advantage was overwhelming defensive positions. Gates were buckling, walls were being climbed. The second wave of assaults had cost another 3,000 defenders, while killing perhaps 30,000 Whites. Still favorable exchange ratio, still not enough to prevent eventual defeat. "How long can we hold?" Tyrion asked Daenerys during a brief lull as Whites consolidated for the third wave. "Another day?" Daenerys estimated, exhaustion making her voice rough. Maybe 2 if we're fortunate and the Night King doesn't commit his White Walkers to coordinating mass assault. But not 3 days. Not long enough for Stannis to arrive with reinforcements. We need Thor to win his battle, need the Night King dead, need the White Army to collapse before we're too depleted to hold the walls. And if Thor loses, then we die defending a city that deserved better than us, Daenerys said simply. But we die having proven the council works. That's worth something. Maybe not enough to justify all the deaths, but something. In the ice arena, Thor saw his opening. The Night King attacked high, ice sword sweeping toward Thor's head, in a strike that would have decapitated him if it landed. Thor parried with Mjolnir, accepting the impact and using it to redirect the Night King's momentum upward and to the right, pulling the ancient being into a position where his chest was exposed for perhaps half a second. It was enough. The Thor struck with Mjolnir, not enhanced by divine power, but with every ounce of strength his Asgardian physiology could generate. The hammer hit the Night King's chest directly over where the dragonglass shard resided, and the impact shattered ice that shouldn't have been breakable. The dragonglass shard exploded into fragments driven deeper into the Night King's chest by force measured in tons per square inch. The transformation anchor, the point where human had become White Walker, was destroyed, and the magic holding the Night King together began to unravel. The Night King screamed. It was the first sound Thor had heard him make. Not mental communication, but actual vocalization, emerging from a throat that had been silent for 8,000 years. The sound was agony and rage and disbelief that something unkillable could be killed. The all compressed into a wail that made the arena's ice walls crack. The Night King's body began to fracture, literal cracks spreading across his skin like ice under stress. Blue light bleeding from the fissures as magic leaked from a container that could no longer hold it. His ice sword shattered. His undead dragon collapsed miles away as the connection sustaining it failed. And across the battlefield surrounding King's Landing, every White Walker exploded simultaneously into ice crystals that dissolved on the wind. Every wight collapsed as the magic animating them failed. 300,000 corpses simply stopped being animated and became inert bodies scattered across the frozen ground. The siege ended in an instant. The Night King looked at Thor with eyes that were still glowing blue, but which carried something that might have been recognition or respect or simply acknowledgement that he'd lost. "You found the weakness," the Night King's voice whispered in Thor's mind, growing fainter as magic failed. "The one vulnerability I spent 8,000 years protecting. Clever, worthy. Perhaps gods do deserve their legends. Perhaps heroes can..." The voice faded entirely. The Night King's body collapsed into ice crystals that scattered like snow, dispersing on winds that suddenly felt warmer, as if winter itself was retreating now that its champion had fallen. Thor stood alone in the arena, Mjolnir heavy in his hand, exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced, and alive when he'd genuinely expected to die. He'd won. Against 8,000 years of accumulated dark magic, against an enemy who'd defeated every previous champion, against odds that should have been impossible, he'd won. The ice walls surrounding the arena melted, revealing King's Landing's defenders staring at the battlefield where 300,000 white corpses lay motionless, and the White Walkers that had commanded them had simply ceased to exist. The long night was over. Winter had been defeated, and the god of thunder had proven that some battles could be won, not through overwhelming power, but through finding the precise weakness and exploiting it with perfect timing. Daenerys's dragon landed beside Thor, and she dismounted with expression mixing relief, exhaustion, and triumph. "You won," she said simply. "You actually won. The Night King is dead. The Whites are gone. The long night is—" She stopped mid-sentence because Thor was collapsing. The ice sword hadn't struck a killing blow, but it had struck true enough. Fragments of the blade remained in Thor's chest from the dozens of exchanges where parries hadn't been perfect, and those fragments were spreading cold through his divine physiology the same way the dragonglass shard had sustained the Night King. "I won," Thor agreed, his voice weak. "But the Night King's sword, it's killing me. Slowly, fragments embedded in my chest, freezing my divine energy, turning my strength against me. I can feel it spreading. Won't be fast, might take days, maybe weeks, but without treatment I've never seen and magic I don't understand. The Night King will kill me even after death." He looked at Daenerys, at the city he'd saved, at the council system that had proven itself through surviving the greatest test imaginable. "But the council held," Thor said, and his voice carried satisfaction that made dying feel less like failure. "You coordinated defense without me. The system worked. That was the test, whether Westeros could survive without gods protecting it. You passed, which means even if I die, it wasn't for nothing." "You're not dying," Daenerys said firmly, supporting his weight. "We'll find a way to remove the fragments. You'll govern," Thor interrupted gently. "You and Tyrion and the council. You'll rebuild from this, establish that the system can maintain peace as well as survive war, prove that breaking the wheel was right. And if I die before seeing that, if the ice fragments kill me before I can return to Asgard, then at least I'll die knowing I was worthy. That's enough." The defenders rushed to support their protector as he collapsed, carrying him back to the Red Keep while healers frantically searched for ways to remove ice that shouldn't exist and which was killing a god through simple persistence. The long night had ended, but whether the god of thunder would survive to see spring remained uncertain. Thor lies dying in the Red Keep while healers struggle to remove the ice fragments, slowly freezing his divine physiology. The council faces its greatest test, governing without the protector while the realm rebuilds from the long night's devastation. Stannis arrives with the main army to find the battle already won, but the political situation fragile as factions debate whether to maintain the council system or restore monarchy now that Thor cannot enforce his judgment. And in Asgard, Heimdall senses Thor's condition and prepares the Bifrost for one final journey. But bringing Thor home means leaving Westeros without its protector permanently, testing whether the system can survive when the god who created it has left.